July 25, 1944. Saint-Lô, Normandy, France. SS-Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann pressed his eye against the rubber eyepiece of his Tiger Eyes commander's optic, scanning the bocage hedgerows that checkered the Norman countryside like a medieval patchwork quilt. The morning mist still clung to the sunken lanes and thick vegetation, but it was burning off fast under the July sun. Through the haze, movement. American armor, pushing south from the shattered town of Saint-Lô. He counted them as they emerged from behind the earthen walls and ancient hedgerows. 1, 2, 5, 8, 12 M4 Shermans, their olive drab paint dulled by weeks of combat and Norman mud. A thin smile crossed Wittmann's lips. He'd destroyed 138 enemy tanks on the Eastern Front. These American machines, with their vertical armor plates and underpowered 75mm guns, were coffins on tracks. The German tankers had a nickname for them, Tommy cookers, because of how quickly they burned when penetrated. The British crews who often manned them called their own tanks Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter company's slogan, "Lights first time, every time." "Loaded, Herr Obersturmführer," announced Balthasar Wall, the gunner, his voice crackling through the intercom. The breech of the 88mm kilowatt K36L56 gun was closed, a tungsten cord round waiting in the chamber. At this range, roughly 1,200 meters, the Tiger's legendary gun could punch through the Sherman's frontal armor like paper. The American tank's own 75mm gun would need to close to point-blank range, perhaps 500 meters or less, and even then would need to hit the Tiger's sides or rear to have any chance of penetration. "Target, lead tank," Wittmann ordered, his voice calm, almost bored. "Range 1200. Fire when ready." The Tiger's turret whined as Wall traversed the massive gun onto target. Through his own periscope, loader Karl Wagner could see the lead Sherman clearly, now a standard M4A1 with a rounded, cast hull. Its commander stood partially exposed in his turret hatch, binoculars raised, searching for threats he couldn't yet see. Wagner had loaded and reloaded the 8800s of times. He knew what came next. The Sherman commander would die without ever knowing what killed him. The Tiger rocked backward as the 88 discharged, the muzzle blast sending a shockwave through the hedgerows, leaves and branches shaking violently from the overpressure. 1 second of flight time. The armor-piercing round struck the Sherman's glacis plate at a near-perpendicular angle, the hardened steel core punching through the rolled homogeneous armor just 51mm thick on the front slope and entering the fighting compartment at supersonic speed. What happened next took less than 3 seconds, but for the 4 American tankers inside, it was an eternity. The penetrating round fragmented, sending white-hot metal shards ricocheting through the crew compartment. Hydraulic fluid sprayed from severed lines. The driver, Private James Kowalski from Detroit, was killed instantly, his body torn by shrapnel. The force of the penetration and the secondary fragmentation ignited the stored ammunition, 75mm rounds stacked in the hull sponsons and ready racks. The Sherman erupted from within, hatches blown open by the overpressure, orange flame and black smoke billowing into the morning air. The rest of the American column halted immediately, tanks pivoting desperately, commanders screaming into radios, trying to locate the threat. This was the Sherman's nightmare scenario, caught in the open by a Tiger they couldn't see, at a range where they were helpless. Wittmann's crew was already loading the next round. "Target, second tank, right side," Wittmann called. Another boom. Another Sherman brewing up, this one a more advanced M4A3 with a Ford GAA engine. 20 seconds later, a third Sherman exploded. Then a fourth. The American formation was breaking apart now, some tanks attempting to reverse behind the inadequate cover of hedgerows, others charging forward in a desperate attempt to close the range. This was what the American tanks were designed for, not dueling with Tigers at long range, but supporting infantry, destroying fortifications, providing mobile firepower. But here, in the killing fields of Normandy, German doctrine had created the perfect conditions for the Tiger to shine. Every tactical advantage favored the German machines. Prepared positions, long sight lines, superior optics, overwhelming firepower. At Wehrmacht headquarters in Paris, Generalfeldmarschall Gunther von Kluge received hourly reports of such engagements. His staff officers compiled them meticulously, documenting Tiger and Panther kills, measuring them against German losses. The mathematics were encouraging. For every German heavy tank lost, the Americans were losing 5, 6, sometimes 10 Shermans. Panzer tacticians wrote confident assessments. The American medium tank was obsolete, inadequate for modern armored warfare, a relic of pre-war thinking. Some officers joked darkly that the Americans were so wealthy, they could afford to use their tanks as ammunition, throwing them away to kill single German vehicles. Major General Hans Eberbach, commanding Panzer Group West, sat in his command post that evening reviewing the day's action reports. The Americans had lost 47 medium tanks in his sector. 47. His own losses: 1 Panther damaged but recoverable, 3 Panzer IVs destroyed. He lit a cigarette and studied the map of Normandy, marked with blue and red symbols showing the positions of German and Allied forces. "They learn slowly," he remarked to his operations officer, Oberstleutnant Fritz Bayerlein. "They keep sending these Shermans forward in company-strength formations. No coordination, no proper reconnaissance. Our Panthers tear them apart." Bayerlein nodded, but his expression was troubled. "Herr General, if I may, there is something in the latest intelligence reports. The Americans landed with approximately 400 medium tanks in the first week. We've destroyed over 300 confirmed kills since D-Day. Yet their tank strength appears unchanged. In fact, the prisoner interrogations suggest they may have more armor now than when they started." Eberbach waved dismissively. "Prisoner exaggerations. Men under stress, frightened, they overestimate enemy strength. It's always been this way." "Perhaps, Herr General. But the reconnaissance flights, when we can get them through the Allied air superiority, they show continuous landing operations. Ships in the channel, LSDs on the beaches. Cargo, men, equipment. Endless streams of it." "What are you suggesting, Fritz?" "Only that we should consider what if they can replace their losses. What if, for every 10 Shermans we destroy, they land 20 more?" Eberbach stood and walked to the map, studying the expanding Allied beachhead. The thought was troubling, but he pushed it aside. Germany had the superior weapons, the superior tactics, the superior soldiers. Quality would triumph over quantity. It always had. 300 kilometers to the east, in the Ruhr Valley, the night shift was ending at the Henschel and Sohn factory in Kassel. This was where Germany's Tigers were born, each one hand-assembled by skilled workers, each component fitted and tested with Teutonic precision. In the production hall, under flickering electric lights, 4 Tiger is sat in various stages of completion. One was receiving its armor plates, welded and bolted into place by experienced craftsmen. Another was having its transmission installed, a complex, temperamental piece of engineering that required careful calibration. A third was undergoing final testing, its massive Maybach HL 230 engine running, mechanics monitoring oil pressure and temperature. Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of Armored Troops, had toured this facility 3 weeks prior. He'd stood in this very hall, watching the painstaking process, and asked the plant manager a simple question: "How many per month?" "We're averaging 25 Tigers, Herr General. Possibly 30 if we have no material shortages." 25. 30 if they were lucky. The Tiger was a masterpiece of engineering, nearly impervious frontally, mounting the finest anti-tank gun in the world. But each one took thousands of man-hours to build. Each one required components manufactured at a dozen different facilities across increasingly bomb-damaged Germany. Each one was precious, irreplaceable. Guderian had said nothing, but he'd done the mathematics in his head. Even if every factory in Germany worked at full capacity, even if the Allied bombing stopped tomorrow, Germany would produce perhaps 400 heavy tanks in a year. 400 Tigers and Panthers combined. In that same 24-hour period, across the Atlantic Ocean, different factories told a different story. The Chrysler Tank Arsenal in Warren, Michigan, just outside Detroit, ran 3 shifts around the clock. The production line was nearly half a mile long, a marvel of American industrial engineering designed by the same men who'd created the automobile assembly line. Raw steel entered one end, completed M4 Shermans rolled out the other. Every component was standardized, interchangeable, mass-produced. Where German Tigers required hand-fitting and skilled craftsmen, Shermans were assembled by workers who'd been farmhands and salesmen just 2 years prior, taught to install specific parts in specific ways, the same motion repeated thousands of times until it became automatic. Every 8 hours, another 12 Shermans were completed. Every 8 hours. That was just one factory. The Fisher Tank Arsenal in Grand Blanc was producing 12 more. The Pressed Steel Car Company in Pennsylvania, another 10. Ford's River Rouge Complex, the Pacific Car and Foundry Company, the Federal Machine and Welder Company, the Pullman Standard Car Manufacturing Company, all churning out Shermans at rates that would have seemed impossible in peacetime. Shift supervisor Bill Morrison walked the Warren production line at 2 a.m., clipboard in hand, checking quality control points. He was 48 years old, had worked for Ford before the war, and now oversaw 300 workers building tanks for Uncle Sam. The line never stopped. Even now, in the dead of night, welding sparks showered down from overhead platforms where women in coveralls - Rosie the Riveters attached armor plates to hull assemblies. Pneumatic tools hammered continuously. Overhead cranes swung massive engine blocks into position. At Station 37, a team installed the final drive assemblies. At Station 42, they mounted the 75mm gun. At Station 51, they tested the radios. Morrison paused at the end of the line, where a freshly completed M4A3 sat, its engine running, gauges verified, ready for delivery to the Army. The tank's registration number was stenciled on its side, 51,447. That meant this facility alone had produced more than 51,000 Shermans. And they weren't slowing down. Back in Normandy, as dawn broke on July 26, Michael Wittmann climbed from his Tiger's turret, stretching tired muscles. His crew had destroyed 17 American tanks in the previous 48 hours. 17 confirmed kills. He lit a cigarette, looking east toward the rising sun, and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The Americans might have numbers, but they didn't have Tigers. They didn't have the 88. They didn't have crews with his experience. What he didn't know, what none of the German commanders knew, was that in the previous 24 hours, American factories had produced more replacement Shermans than Germany would produce of all tank types in the next month. The tanks his crew had destroyed yesterday were already replaced. The formations they'd shattered were already reconstituted. And somewhere in the endless columns of American vehicles snaking south from the beaches, fresh Shermans were moving forward, crewed by fresh-faced kids from Kansas and California and New York, none of whom had his skill or experience, but all of whom had something more important. They had gas. They had ammunition. They had spare parts. They had air support. They had artillery support. And most importantly, they had more tanks coming. Always more tanks coming. The Americans could afford to lose 10 Shermans to kill one Tiger because they had 10 more where those came from, and 10 more after that, and 10 more after that. The mathematics of industrial warfare were about to make tactical excellence irrelevant. But on that morning, as Wittmann flicked his cigarette into the mud and climbed back into his Tiger's turret, he didn't know that yet. None of them did. They were about to learn. August 3, 1944. Utah Beach, Normandy. Lieutenant Robert "Bobby" Henderson stood on the ramp of LSD 517 as it ground onto the sand, seawater sloshing around his boots. Behind him, the distinctive growl of 5 Continental and 975 radial engines filled the pre-dawn air, the sound of 5 brand-new M4A1 Shermans, their tracks clanking against the metal deck, ready to roll off into France. Henderson was 23 years old, from Topeka, Kansas, and 6 weeks ago he'd been stateside at Fort Knox, training on tanks that were already obsolete by the time they reached the European theater. The Sherman he commanded now had left the Chrysler Arsenal in Michigan 72 hours earlier. 72 hours. From the factory floor in Detroit to a combat zone in France in 3 days. The logistics of it staggered the imagination. Rail transport to the East Coast, loading cranes working day and night at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, the Atlantic crossing with destroyer escorts protecting against U-boats, the transfer to LSDs in Southampton, and now here, rumbling down a steel ramp onto Omaha Beach's successor site at Utah, ready for war. "Move it out, Henderson," shouted Major Tom Blackwood from the beach, waving them forward. "We need your platoon up at the front by 6 o'clock. 2nd Armored is bleeding tanks and they need replacements now." Henderson dropped into his commander's hatch, plugged in his CVC helmet, and keyed the intercom. "Driver, advance. Follow the marked route. Gunner, keep your eyes open for air attack." "Yes, sir," replied Corporal Eddie Martinez from Los Angeles, his hands on the lateral control sticks. The Sherman lurched forward, tracks biting into the sand, then finding purchase on the wooden planking laid down by army engineers. They rolled past the organized chaos of the beachhead mountains of supplies covered in camouflage netting, ordnance depots with rows of artillery shells stacked like cordwood, fuel dumps with thousands of jerry cans, field hospitals marked with red crosses, and everywhere, vehicles. Jeeps, trucks, half-tracks, tank destroyers, artillery tractors, and tanks. Dozens of tanks. Hundreds of tanks. A military policeman directed them onto a dirt road that had been churned to soup by thousands of vehicles. Henderson's Sherman joined a column of armor heading south M4S, M4A1S, M4A3S with the newer Ford engines, even a few M4A3E2 jumbo assault tanks with extra armor welded onto their hulls. Some were fresh from the factories like his own. Others were returning from maintenance depots, repaired and refurbished, their battle damage patched, their burnt-out interiors cleaned and repainted. This was the truth that German intelligence was struggling to comprehend. The Americans didn't just build tanks faster than they lost them, they recovered and repaired them faster too. Every disabled Sherman that could be salvaged was dragged back to mobile maintenance facilities, where mechanics worked around the clock. Engines were swapped out in hours. Damaged transmissions replaced with spares that arrived on the same ships as the replacement tanks. Destroyed gun mantlets cut away and new ones welded in place. The Americans had turned tank maintenance into an assembly line process, just like tank production. Henderson's column passed a recovery operation in progress. A knocked-out Sherman turret blown off, hull blackened by fire was being lifted by a massive M26 tank retriever. An ordnance officer was already walking around it with a clipboard, assessing what could be salvaged. The engine looked intact. The tracks were undamaged. The transmission housing wasn't cracked. Within 3 days, most of this tank's components would be cannibalized for repairs. The hull itself would be cut up for scrap metal, which would eventually find its way back to American steel mills to be reforged into new armor plate. By contrast, when a German Tiger broke down, and they broke down frequently, their overstressed transmissions and overheating engines prone to failure, it was often abandoned if it couldn't be repaired on site. The Germans lacked the heavy recovery vehicles to move 60-ton tanks efficiently. They lacked the spare parts to fix them. And even when they could recover a Tiger, getting it back to Germany for factory-level repairs was nearly impossible with Allied fighter bombers controlling the skies. Henderson's platoon reached the forward assembly area at 5:45, 15 minutes ahead of schedule. A harried captain from 2nd Armored Division was waiting, pointing to positions in a tree line. "Park them there, Lieutenant. You're attached to Charlie Company, 1st Battalion. They took a beating yesterday, lost 9 Shermans to a Panther ambush. You're the replacement." 9 tanks, sir." Henderson felt his stomach tighten. "How many crew casualties?" 17 dead, 12 wounded. "But we've got replacement crews coming up from the Reppeldepel this afternoon. You'll be back to full strength by nightfall." Back to full strength by nightfall. That was the American way of war: absorb the casualties, plug in replacements, keep pushing forward. The Germans could win every tactical engagement and still lose the strategic battle because the Americans could afford losses that would cripple the Wehrmacht. 300 kilometers to the southeast, at 7th Army headquarters near Le Mans, Generaloberst Paul Hauser studied reconnaissance photographs with growing concern. His intelligence officer, Major Wilhelm Schmidt, had spread aerial images across the map table, grainy black and white photos taken by one of the few Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes that had survived the gauntlet of American fighters. "This was taken 2 days ago, Herr Generaloberst," Schmidt said, pointing to a photograph showing Utah Beach. "Our analysts count approximately 400 vehicles in this image alone. At least 80 appear to be medium tanks." Hauser leaned closer, squinting at the tiny shapes. 400 vehicles in one photograph. How many photographs? 12, covering the entire beachhead complex. Conservatively, we estimate 3,000 vehicles visible in these images, perhaps 500 of them armored fighting vehicles. And this represents what 1 day's worth of arrivals? Possibly less, Herr Generaloberst. The Americans run continuous landing operations. Weather permitting, they have LSDs arriving every few hours. Hauser straightened, his face grim. He was a veteran of the Eastern Front, where German forces had been ground down by Soviet numbers waves of T-34s and human flesh thrown against prepared positions until the positions crumbled through sheer attrition. He'd hoped the Western Front would be different. The Americans were supposed to be soft, inexperienced, reliant on material superiority rather than martial skill. And they were all those things. But what he was seeing in these photographs suggested something worse than martial skill: infinite material. "Get me a comparison," he ordered. "I want to know our replacement rate versus theirs. How many tanks are we receiving per week, and how many are they landing?" Schmidt hesitated. "Herr Generaloberst, the exact numbers are classified by OKW, but from what I can determine through informal channels, we're receiving approximately 30 to 40 replacement tanks per week across the entire Western Front. Mixed types Panzer IVs, Panthers, a few Tigers when available. And the Americans? We believe they're landing between 200 and 300 replacement vehicles per week. That's replacement vehicles not counting the initial build-up. Most are medium tanks, some tank destroyers, some armored cars." The silence in the command post was profound. 200 versus 40. The mathematics were devastating. Even if German tanks achieved kill ratios of 5 to 1, which they often did in favorable conditions, the Americans would still gain ground through sheer numerical advantage. Hauser walked to the window, staring out at the French countryside. "They're not fighting a war," he said quietly. "They're operating a machine. A machine that takes in raw materials on one end and produces military power on the other. And we can't break machines by killing their parts. We'd have to destroy the factories themselves." The Luftwaffe attempted strategic bombing of American industry in Dash. The Luftwaffe. Hauser's laugh was bitter. The Luftwaffe can barely maintain air superiority over this headquarters, much less mount strategic missions over the Atlantic. "No, Wilhelm. We're going to have to win this war with what we have, against an enemy with infinite resources." What neither Hauser nor any German commander fully understood was the scale of American industrial mobilization. It wasn't just that America was building more tanks, it was that America had reorganized its entire economy for war production with a ruthlessness that the Germans, despite their reputation for efficiency, had never matched. In the United States, civilian automobile production had been completely halted in February 1942. Every automotive factory in America, Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, Willys, Studebaker, had converted to military production. The machine tools that once stamped out car bodies now stamped out tank armor. The assembly lines that once built sedans now built armored vehicles. The supply chains that once delivered parts to car dealerships now delivered parts to army depots. The production numbers told the story. In 1941, before Pearl Harbor, America produced 4,800 tanks. In 1942, that number jumped to 27,000. In 1943, 29,000. By 1944, American factories were producing a Sherman tank every 45 minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The Chrysler Arsenal alone, one of 11 facilities building Shermans, produced 18,000 tanks during the war years. Germany, by contrast, produced 5,900 tanks in 1942, 5,900 in 1943, and about 9,000 in 1944, less than one-third the American output, despite Germany being fully mobilized for total war since 1939. The reasons were complex: Hitler's insistence on over-engineering, constant design modifications that disrupted production, Allied bombing of factories and supply chains, shortage of critical materials like tungsten and molybdenum, and a fundamental misunderstanding of modern industrial warfare. German tanks were designed by engineers seeking perfection. American tanks were designed by engineers seeking mass production. The Sherman wasn't the best tank, it was the tank that could be built in the quantities needed to win. And those quantities kept growing. Back in Michigan, at the Chrysler Arsenal, shift supervisor Bill Morrison watched another Sherman roll off the line at 3:47 a.m. Number 51,448. He initialed the quality control sheet and waved it through to the testing yard. Outside, in the darkness, dozens of completed Shermans sat in neat rows, awaiting rail transport to the East Coast. By dawn, this tank would be on a flatbed car heading to the Brooklyn Navy Yard. By next week, it would be in France. By next month, some German crew would be shooting at it. Morrison had a son in the Army, Private First Class Danny Morrison, assigned to 3rd Armored Division, somewhere in Normandy. Every tank he cleared through final inspection, Morrison imagined might be the one that kept Danny alive. The Sherman had flaws, everyone knew it. The armor was too thin. The gun was too weak. The ammunition storage made it prone to catastrophic fires when penetrated. But it was reliable. It could be repaired. And there were enough of them that even if Danny's tank got knocked out, he'd have another one to climb into tomorrow. That was the Sherman's real advantage. Not that it was the best tank, but that it was good enough, and there were thousands of them. A German Tiger crew might destroy 5 Shermans before they were killed or their tank broke down. But there would be a 6th Sherman, and a 7th, and an 8th. Eventually, through sheer probability, one of those Shermans would get a flank shot, or the Tiger would throw a track, or the Tiger would run out of ammunition, or Allied artillery would bracket it, or a P-47 Thunderbolt would spot it and call in a rocket strike. The Germans were fighting World War II with World War II tactics, quality over quantity, tactical excellence, operational brilliance. The Americans were fighting World War II with World War III thinking, industrial capacity, logistical supremacy, the ability to absorb losses that would break any other army and keep pushing forward. In Normandy, Lieutenant Henderson spent his first night in combat in a muddy field 3 kilometers from the front line, trying to sleep in his Sherman's turret while artillery rumbled in the distance. His loader, Private Tommy Reeves from North Carolina, sat in the turret basket, writing a letter home by flashlight. "You think we'll make it, Lieutenant?" Reeves asked quietly. Henderson considered lying, then decided against it. "I think some of us will. The odds aren't great for individual crews. But we're going to win. There's too many of us for them to stop." "That's not very comforting, sir." "No," Henderson agreed. "But it's the truth. They've got better tanks and better training. But we've got more of everything else. More tanks, more fuel, more ammo, more air support, more artillery. And every day, more stuff arrives and they get less. Eventually, the math catches up." Reeves was quiet for a moment. "You're saying we're going to win by drowning them?" "That's exactly what I'm saying, Private. We're going to drown them in Shermans." 20 kilometers to the south, in a camouflaged position near Mortain, SS-Obersturmführer Werner Wolf watched the eastern horizon through his Panthers commander's periscope, waiting for dawn. His tank was one of 45 Panthers assigned to the 2nd SS Panzer Division. In the past 3 weeks, 18 of those Panthers had been destroyed or disabled. But his division had received only 4 replacements. 4 Panthers to replace 18 losses. Meanwhile, the American units they'd been fighting had remained at constant strength, their destroyed tanks replaced sometimes within hours. Wolf had been a tanker since 1940. He'd fought in France, the Balkans, and Russia. He'd learned his trade in Panzer IIIs against French Char B1S, perfected it in Panzer IVs against T-34s, and now commanded one of Germany's finest weapons. He knew armor tactics, terrain usage, and how to kill enemy tanks efficiently. But for the first time in his career, he was beginning to understand that none of that mattered. You couldn't win a war of attrition when the enemy had unlimited resources and you didn't. Every German tank was precious, irreplaceable. Every loss was a step closer to defeat. But the Americans treated their Shermans like ammunition, expendable, replaceable, just another resource to be consumed in pursuit of victory. As the sun rose over Normandy on August 4, 1944, casting long shadows across the hedgerows and ruined villages, 2 very different military philosophies prepared to collide again. The Germans would fight brilliantly, as they always did. And the Americans would lose tanks, as they always did. But there would always be more Shermans. Always. August 7, 1944. Outside Mortain, France. The morning fog was still thick when Lieutenant Henderson's platoon moved into attack position. 5 Shermans in a wedge formation, advancing through an apple orchard toward a village that intelligence said contained light German resistance. Henderson had learned in 3 days of combat that intelligence was usually wrong about the light part. Contact left. The radio crackled with Sergeant Mike O'Brien's voice. "Panzer, hold down position. Grid 734-." The transmission ended in a screech of static. Henderson's head snapped left in time to see a Bryan's Sherman third in the formation erupt in flame. The turret separated from the hull, blown completely off by internal ammunition detonation, cartwheeling through the air in a grotesque arc before crashing into the apple trees. The hull burned with terrible intensity, white-hot flames shooting from every opening. No one got out. Reverse! Reverse! Get to cover! Henderson screamed into the radio, but his driver Martinez was already backing up, tracks churning mud, the Sherman lurching backward toward the tree line. Another boom. Corporal Davies's tank took a hit, the round punching through the right sponson, but Davies got lucky. The penetration missed the ammunition storage by inches. His crew bailed out, running for cover as their tank smoked but didn't brew up. Henderson's Sherman made it behind a stone wall. His heart hammered against his ribs. 2 tanks gone in 30 seconds. 5 down to 3. Through his periscope, he caught a glimpse of the killer A Panther, positioned perfectly in a hull-down firing position, only its turret visible, its long 75mm gun already traversing toward the next target. Gunner, target Panther, 11 o'clock, 800 meters. Henderson's voice was steadier than he felt. Identified, responded Corporal James Walsh, the gunner, a former farm boy from Iowa who'd never been outside his state until the Army drafted him. His hands moved automatically traverse handwheel, elevation wheel, ranging. The Sherman's 75mm gun was hopelessly outmatched against a Panther at this range, but they had to try. Up, called Loader Reeves, slamming another round into the breech. Fire! The Sherman rocked back on its suspension. Henderson watched through the periscope as the 75mm armor-piercing round struck the Panther's frontal armor and ricocheted skyward, leaving nothing but a scar on the hardened steel. The Panther's turret swiveled toward them with mechanical precision. Driver, move now. Full throttle, forward, get us into that depression dash. Martinez floored it. The Sherman lunged forward, tracks finding purchase. They dropped into a shallow fold in the ground just as the Panther's 75mm fired. The round passed overhead with a sound like tearing fabric, close enough that Henderson felt the pressure wave. They'd missed death by perhaps 3 feet and half a second of timing. "This is Henderson to Falcon 6, he gasped into the radio, calling for the company commander. "Contact with enemy armor, heavy resistance. Request artillery support, grid 734218. Falcon 6 actual. Artillery support approved. Air support inbound, ETA 12 minutes. Can you hold?" "Negative. We're pulling back. Enemy has superior position and firepower." "Understood. Fall back to phase line Dover and reorganize." Henderson's 3 surviving Shermans retreated under smoke cover, leaving 2 burning hulks behind. The engagement had lasted less than 5 minutes. 1 Panther against 5 Shermans. The Panther won decisively, suffering no damage, destroying 2 American tanks and forcing the rest to withdraw. By German tactical doctrine, it was a perfect defensive engagement. But 12 minutes later, 6 P-47 Thunderbolts from the 405th Fighter Group arrived overhead. The pilots spotted the Panther immediately. Its camouflage was excellent against ground observers but useless against aerial reconnaissance. The first pass was rockets, 2 5-inch HVRs that bracketed the Panther's position, one striking close enough to damage the tracks. The second pass was .50 caliber fire, forcing the crew to button up, blocking their vision. The third pass was high-explosive bombs. SS-Obersturmführer Werner Wolf never saw what killed him. The 500-pound bomb landed 5 meters from his Panther, the blast wave flipping the 45-ton tank onto its side like a toy. The explosion crushed the turret, killed the crew instantly, and turned Germany's most advanced medium tank into scrap metal. By 1500 hours, Henderson's platoon had received 2 replacement Shermans. The crews were green-fresh from training, white-faced and scared, but the tanks themselves were combat-ready. Lieutenant Henderson was back to 5 tanks, minus 1 day's fighting. The 2 tanks destroyed that morning were already being processed by recovery teams. 1 hull would be salvaged for parts. The other was too badly damaged but would be dragged back anyway, its steel to be recycled. This was the arithmetic of annihilation that the Germans were slowly, painfully coming to understand. They could win every tactical engagement and still lose the war. Every German tank destroyed was irreplaceable. Every American tank destroyed was replaced, usually within 24 hours. At 7th Army headquarters, Generaloberst received the daily loss reports with increasingly hollow eyes. August 7th, 17 German tanks destroyed, 4 Tigers, 6 Panthers, 7 Panzer IVs, estimated enemy losses 61 tanks destroyed, 40 plus damaged. It looked like a German victory. A 5-to-1 kill ratio. But Hauser now knew the terrible truth. By tomorrow morning, the Americans would have 61 replacement tanks. Germany would have, if they were lucky, 3. "We're killing them faster than they can train crews," offered Major Schmidt, trying to find some optimism in the numbers. "Eventually, they'll run out of trained tankers." Hauser shook his head. "Wilhelm, they're training tankers in 48 different facilities across the United States. Fort Knox alone graduates 500 new armor crewmen every week. They're training them on the same tanks they'll fight in, so the transition is seamless. And even if a crew is green, even if they make mistakes, the tank itself is reliable. It starts, it moves, it shoots. That's more than I can say for half our Panthers." It was true. The Panther, despite being one of the finest tanks in the world when it worked, was plagued by mechanical issues. Its Maybach HL 230 engine ran hot, especially in the summer heat. Its final drive gears were overstressed, prone to failure, and required factory-level repair when they broke. Its fuel pump was temperamental. A Panther required 10 hours of maintenance for every hour of operation. When German units reported 50 tanks operational, it often meant they had 80 tanks total but only 50 that could actually move and fight. The Sherman, by contrast, was engineered for reliability. Its Continental R975 radial engine was derived from an aircraft engine, proven and durable. Its vertical volute spring suspension, VVSS, was simple, easy to maintain, and robust. A Sherman crew could perform most maintenance with basic tools. When something broke, replacement parts arrived within days, sometimes hours. An American armored division reported 50 tanks operational, and meant exactly that 50 tanks ready to fight right now, with another 50 in various stages of maintenance that would be ready soon, and more arriving from the replacement pool constantly. August 15, 1944. Falaise Pocket, France. The Germans were trapped. 7 divisions, more than 100,000 men, thousands of vehicles, the remnants of the 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army caught in a pocket between advancing American forces from the west and British Canadian forces from the north. The only escape route was a narrow gap near Chambouy, and through that gap, the shattered remnants of Hitler's army in France were trying to flee. Captain Friedrich Hartmann commanded the last 6 Tigers of Schwerpanzerabteilung 503, Heavy Tank Battalion 503. 6 Tigers from an original complement of 45. The rest were destroyed, broken down, or abandoned for lack of fuel. His own Tiger number 231 was running on fumes. The division's fuel trucks had been destroyed by Allied fighter bombers 2 days ago. Every vehicle in the pocket was siphoning fuel from disabled vehicles, scavenging jerry cans from the dead, doing anything to keep moving. Hartmann stood in his turret hatch, watching the road ahead. It was clogged with vehicles, trucks, half-tracks, staff cars, ambulances, horse-drawn carts, soldiers on foot. Everyone trying to escape the pocket before it closed completely. Overhead, the sky roared with Allied aircraft. P-47s, P-51s, British Typhoons with their devastating rockets. They circled like vultures, diving to strafe anything that moved. The smoke from burning vehicles turned day into twilight. "Movement ahead," Herr Hauptmann called his gunner. American tanks, blocking the road. Maybe 20 of them. Hartmann raised his binoculars. Shermans, strung across the highway in a defensive line. They'd set up a roadblock, knowing the Germans would come this way. It was a slaughter pen. The Tigers could probably destroy half of them, but they'd run out of ammunition, and more Shermans would arrive. There were always more Shermans. "Can we go around?" he asked his driver. "Negative, sir. The terrain is too soft. We'd bog down immediately." 20 Shermans. 6 Tigers. Under normal circumstances, the Tigers would win that fight easily. But these weren't normal circumstances. They were low on fuel, low on ammunition, exhausted crews that hadn't slept in 48 hours. And even if they won, even if they destroyed all 20 Shermans and broke through, there would be more American armor beyond. Always more. Hartmann made the hardest decision of his military career. Abandon the vehicles. Rig them for demolition. We're breaking out on foot. His crew stared at him in disbelief. Abandon a Tiger? The most powerful tank in the world? Sir, the tank is still operational. We can fight dash. To what end, Klaus? To destroy 20 tanks before we're killed or captured. To buy an extra hour? The war here is over. I'm not throwing away your lives for a gesture. Hartmann climbed down from the Tiger, his boots hitting French soil. Set the demolition charges. 5 minutes. Within the hour, all 6 Tigers were burning. The crews had placed grenades in the breeches of the 88mm guns, packed thermite charges around the engines, set fire to everything that would burn. Better to destroy them than let them fall into enemy hands intact. Captain Hartmann and his men joined the river of refugees fleeing east on foot. Behind them, the Tigers burned with chemical intensity, flames reaching 30 feet into the air. A column of black smoke marked each one, visible for miles. Somewhere, an American forward observer was radioing coordinates, calling in artillery on those smoke columns, just to make sure. The Americans didn't understand what they were destroying. These weren't just tanks, they were the pinnacle of German engineering, each one worth a dozen Shermans in combat, each one representing thousands of hours of skilled labor. But to the Americans, they were just targets. Knock them out, move forward, do it again tomorrow. War as industrial process. August 20th, 1944. American Logistics Depot, Cherbourg. Staff Sergeant Kevin Murphy walked through the vast depot with a clipboard, conducting his daily inventory. The depot covered 40 acres of what used to be the Cherbourg Harbor District. Now it was a carefully organized maze of supplies, equipment, and vehicles. Row after row of Shermans, some fresh from the States, others returned from maintenance. Artillery pieces. Trucks. Half-tracks. Jeeps. Mountain ranges of jerry cans filled with gasoline. Ammunition of every caliber stacked in sandbag-protected magazines. Murphy's job was to track it all, to make sure that when the frontline units called for supplies, those supplies could be delivered immediately. He'd been doing logistics since North Africa, and he'd learned that wars weren't won by brave soldiers or superior weapons, they were won by supply chains. The side that could feed its army, fuel its vehicles, and replace its losses would win. Everything else was details. "Sarge, we've got 43 new Shermans arrived this morning," called Corporal Anderson, pointing to a section of the depot. "Where do you want them?" "Section 7, near the maintenance bays. And get me a manifest, I need to know which units are requesting replacements." Murphy checked his paperwork. "Looks like 2nd Armored needs 12 ASAP. 3rd Armored needs 18. 4th Armored needs 8. Tag those tanks and get them ready for rail transport." "What about the rest?" "Reserve pool. Something tells me they won't be reserved for long." Murphy's prediction was accurate. By nightfall, 38 of those 43 Shermans were on trains heading to forward depots. The remaining 5 would be allocated tomorrow. The American replacement system was so efficient that tank crews sometimes joked they spent more time learning new tank serial numbers than actually fighting. Meanwhile, 300 kilometers to the east, in what was left of the German logistics system, Oberleutnant Hans Kessler sat in a makeshift supply depot near the German border, staring at a mostly empty warehouse. He'd received a requisition from 2nd Panzer Division, 12 replacement tanks urgently needed. He had 3 Panzer IVs available. 3. And 2 of those were awaiting parts for engine repairs that might never arrive because the factory that made those parts had been bombed by the Americans last week. "Send a message to Division," Kessler said tiredly to his clerk. 3 Panzer IVs available, ready for transport in 48 hours pending railcar availability. Regret cannot fulfill complete request. Advise units to cannibalize disabled vehicles for parts and to prioritize vehicle maintenance. The clerk typed up the message, but both men knew what it meant. 2nd Panzer Division had lost 12 tanks and would receive 3 replacements. They'd asked for meat and been given crumbs. And this was happening across every German unit on every front. The arithmetic was simple and devastating. Losses exceeded replacements, week after week, month after month. The German army was being ground down by attrition, not because they were poor soldiers, but because they couldn't replace what they lost. September 1st, 1944. Outside Paris. Lieutenant Henderson stood on the turret of his Sherman, his third Sherman since landing in France 6 weeks ago, and watched American tanks roll into Paris. The liberation of the city was a moment of incredible joy. French civilians throwing flowers, kissing soldiers, celebrating their freedom. But Henderson's mind was elsewhere, calculating. His platoon had started with 5 tanks on August 3rd. Over the past month, he'd lost 9 Shermans to enemy action. 9. But he'd never dropped below 3 operational tanks because replacements arrived so fast. Crews were lost, 14 men killed or wounded from his platoon alone, but new crews arrived from replacement depots. Green, scared kids who had to learn on the job, but they learned. He thought about the German tanks they'd faced. Tigers, Panthers, Panzer IVs. Every one of them was a formidable weapon, better than his Sherman in almost every measurable way. But here he was, in Paris, and where were those German tanks? Destroyed, abandoned, out of fuel, out of ammunition, or retreating east toward Germany. The Germans had lost the battle of production before the first shot was fired in France. They just didn't know it until the Shermans kept coming, and coming, and coming, like a tide that never stopped rising. Henderson pulled out a battered notebook and did some rough math. His battalion 45 tanks authorized strength had been issued 97 replacement tanks in 5 weeks. They'd destroyed or disabled an estimated 140 German armored vehicles. But the Germans had been unable to replace their losses. Every German tank knocked out was one less tank. Every American tank knocked out was replaced the next day. "Hey, Lieutenant," called Martinez from the driver's hatch. "We moving out?" "Yeah, Eddie. We're moving out. All the way to Germany. Think we'll make it?" Henderson looked at his Sherman, scarred, dented, patched in a dozen places, but running fine. Factory number was 52,884. That meant this tank had been built maybe 3 months ago. It would probably be knocked out in the next few weeks. But there'd be tank number 52,885 waiting. And 52,886 after that. "Yeah," Henderson said. "We'll make it. Some of us, anyway. There's too many of us not to." December 16th, 1944. Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Snow fell heavily on the frozen forest roads as Obersturmbannführer Johann Paper stood in the commander's cupola of his Panther, watching the column behind him, the spearhead of Operation Wattam Rhine, Hitler's last desperate gamble in the West. Behind Paper's lead company stretched a column of panzers that represented nearly everything Germany could scrape together for this offensive. 70 King Tigers, Panthers, and Panzer IVs, assigned to the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. 70 tanks. It had taken months to assemble this force, stripping units from other sectors, pulling precious reserves from defensive positions, hoarding fuel from the dwindling supply. This was supposed to be Germany's breakthrough, a lightning thrust through the Ardennes, splitting the American and British armies, driving to Antwerp to cut off Allied supplies, forcing a negotiated peace. But Paper knew the truth that Hitler's staff officers refused to acknowledge. 70 tanks wasn't a breakthrough force. It was barely a divisional strength attack. And even if they succeeded, even if they broke through to Antwerp, the Americans would simply ship more tanks from their inexhaustible factories and come at them again. Fuel status. Paper called down to his driver. 3/4 full, Herr Obersturmbannführer. But the fuel trucks behind us are reporting they're carrying only 60% of planned loads. The refineries couldn't deliver the full allocation. 60%. They were starting the offensive with partial fuel loads. Paper had calculated that even with full fuel, they'd need to capture American fuel dumps to reach their objectives. With only 60%, they'd run dry somewhere around the Meuse River, still kilometers short of Antwerp. But orders were orders. The column advanced through the snow, catching the thinly held American front line by surprise. For the first 2 days, it looked like the German plan might work. American units reeled back in confusion, Whole battalions surrounded and captured. The weather was terrible, heavy clouds and snow that grounded Allied aircraft. For once, the Germans were fighting without the constant threat of American air power overhead. But by the third day, the American response began. Not brilliant counterattacks or tactical masterstrokes, just mass. Sheer, overwhelming mass. December 19, 1944. Bastogne, Belgium. Lieutenant Henderson's platoon was part of the relief column racing toward Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne was surrounded. His 4th Sherman since August, factory number 54,211, churned through the snow, part of a column of armor that stretched for kilometers. Behind him came more Shermans, and tank destroyers, and half-tracks full of infantry. 3rd Army was pivoting north, 90 degrees from their line of advance, bringing 4 divisions to bear on the German penetration. The speed of the American response was something German planners hadn't anticipated. 3rd Army moved 133,000 men and 11,000 vehicles 90 degrees in 48 hours, across icy roads, in the middle of winter. It was a logistical miracle, possible only because American supply lines were so robust, so over-engineered, that they could handle sudden massive surges in demand. Henderson's radio crackled constantly with traffic. Units calling for ammunition. Artillery requesting fire missions. Tank companies reporting contact with German armor. And underneath it all, the steady drumbeat of logistics, fuel convoy approaching Checkpoint 7. Ammunition trucks at Rally Point Baker. Replacement tanks arriving at Depot Charlie. The American war machine was responding to the German offensive the way it responded to everything by drowning it in material. Contact front. Martinez called out. German armor, looks like Panthers, 200 meters. Henderson's heart jumped, but he reacted automatically now, months of combat making the responses instinctive. Gunner. Target left Panther. Wait for my command, let the TDS get in position. Behind his Sherman, M10 tank destroyers were maneuvering, their 3-inch guns capable of penetrating Panther armor at this range. This was how the Americans had learned to fight, not Sherman versus Panther in fair duels, but combined arms. Use the Shermans to fix the enemy in place, bring up the TDS with the bigger guns, call in artillery, get air support if the weather cleared. Overwhelm the Germans with everything at once. The engagement lasted 12 minutes. Henderson's platoon lost 2 Shermans. But the Panthers were destroyed by the tank destroyers, and within an hour, 2 replacement Shermans arrived from the rear. The German Panthers. Irreplaceable. December 24, 1944. Near St. Vith. Johann Pieper's spearhead had stalled. Not from American tactical brilliance, but from simple arithmetic. His column had run out of fuel 30 kilometers short of the Meuse River, exactly as he'd feared. Behind him, the promised fuel convoys had been destroyed by American fighter bombers when the weather cleared. Now his Panthers and King Tigers sat immobile, burning through their remaining ammunition defending static positions, while American armor maneuvered around them. How many operational tanks do we have? Paper asked his adjutant. 17, Herr Obersturmbannführer. We've lost 19 to combat, 12 to mechanical breakdown, and 22 we've had to abandon for lack of fuel. 17 from 70. And those 17 were going nowhere. Paper made the decision that dozens of German commanders were making across the Ardennes that Christmas. Prepare to retreat. Destroy all vehicles that can't move under their own power. We're breaking out on foot. By Christmas Day, the Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last great gamble, was effectively over. The Germans had achieved tactical surprise and initial success. But the American response had been too fast, too massive, too overwhelming. For every German tank in the offensive, the Americans had rushed 5 to counter it. And when German tanks broke down or ran out of fuel, they stayed broken. When American tanks were knocked out, they were replaced. The numbers told the story. Germany committed about 1,400 tanks and assault guns to the Ardennes offensive, representing nearly everything they could scrape together. The Americans brought approximately 5,000 armored vehicles to bear in response, and when losses mounted, more arrived. By mid-January, when the bulge was finally reduced, Germany had lost roughly 800 armored vehicles they couldn't replace. America had lost over 700 tanks and had already replaced them all. January 15, 1945. Chrysler Tank Arsenal, Warren, Michigan. Bill Morrison walked the production line at 2 a.m., just as he had every night shift for 3 years. Sherman number 61847 was rolling through final assembly. He paused to watch his workers install the final components. Most were women now, the men either overseas or in other war industries. They worked with practiced efficiency, every motion economical, every part going exactly where it belonged. Morrison had heard about the Ardennes offensive. The newspapers called it the Battle of the Bulge. They said the Germans had made a desperate last attack, that American forces had held firm, that victory in Europe was now inevitable. But Morrison knew the real story. He read the production reports. He knew how many tanks were being shipped to Europe every week. December production, 1,854 Shermans from all factories combined. January was on track for similar numbers. The Chrysler Arsenal alone had produced 1,147 tanks in December. One factory, in 1 month, had produced more tanks than Germany's entire industry could manage. And there were 10 other factories building Shermans, plus factories building tank destroyers, and self-propelled artillery, and armored cars. Mr. Morrison. A young woman approached Betty Sanchez, one of his best welders. We just got word. My husband's Unit 3rd Armored Division they're in Germany now. They crossed the border yesterday. Morrison smiled. That's good news, Betty. Real good news. Do you think the tanks we're building, do you think they'll help bring the boys home faster? Morrison looked at the production line, at the steady flow of steel being transformed into instruments of war. Yeah, Betty. I think they will. Every tank we build is one more the Germans have to face. Eventually, the math catches up. And it was catching up. By January 1945, Germany was producing fewer than 300 tanks per month across all types. The factories were being bombed, the supply chains were broken, the skilled workers were being drafted to fill gaps in the infantry. What they did produce often couldn't reach the front lines, no fuel for transport, rail lines cut by Allied air attacks, bridges destroyed. Meanwhile, American production continued unabated. Factories running 3 shifts. Supply ships crossing the Atlantic in protected convoys. Tanks arriving in European depots faster than units could absorb them. The replacement pools were so full that some Shermans sat in depots for weeks waiting for assignment. March 7, 1945. Remagen Bridge, Germany. Lieutenant Henderson's Sherman, his 7th of the war, was among the first American tanks to cross the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, the last standing bridge across the Rhine. Behind him stretched a column of armor that seemed endless. Shermans, M26 Pershings with their new 90mm guns, tank destroyers, self-propelled artillery. Everything the Americans needed to plunge deep into the heart of Germany. On the eastern bank, Henderson paused and climbed out of his turret, looking back at the bridge. Trucks were already crossing, bringing ammunition, fuel, supplies. Engineers were working frantically to reinforce the structure. Within hours, a pontoon bridge would be in place beside it, doubling capacity. The American logistics machine was unstoppable now. Henderson thought about the German tanks they'd faced in the past 9 months. The Tigers that had terrified his crews in Normandy. The Panthers that had destroyed so many Shermans in the hedgerows. The King Tigers that could kill at ranges where the Sherman couldn't even fight back. Every single one had been a superior weapon. Better armor, better guns, better optics. But they'd lost anyway. Lost because there were 50,000 Shermans and only 1,500 Tigers ever built. Lost because American factories could replace losses faster than German guns could create them. Lost because the Americans understood that war was industry, and they'd turned industry into a weapon more powerful than any tank. A jeep pulled up, and a Colonel Henderson didn't recognize climbed out. Lieutenant Henderson. Yes, sir. I'm Colonel Braxton, Ordnance Department. I'm conducting a study on tank effectiveness. According to records, you've commanded tank platoons continuously since August. You've been issued 9 different Shermans, 7 as replacements for destroyed vehicles. Is that correct? Yes, sir. 7 destroyed, 2 transferred when I got promoted from platoon to company command.
And you survived all of it. How?
Henderson thought about the question.
Luck, sir. Mostly luck.
But also there was always another tank. Every time mine got knocked out, if I survived, there was another Sherman waiting. We could afford to learn from our mistakes because we got second chances.
The Germans?
They didn't get second chances.
Braxton nodded, making notes.
The Sherman has taken a lot of criticism. Inferior armor, inadequate gun, tendency to burn when penetrated. But you're still here, and we're in Germany, and the Germans are beaten. What's your assessment? The Sherman wasn't the best tank, sir. But it was the tank that won the war.
Know why?
Because there were enough of them. You can have the perfect tank, the best in the world, but if you only have a handful, you lose. We had thousands. We lost thousands. But we always had more. Henderson looked back at the bridge, at the endless stream of American vehicles crossing into Germany. The Germans tried to win with quality. We won with quantity. Turns out quantity has a quality all its own. April 20th, 1945. Outside Berlin. Former SS-Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann was dead, killed by a Sherman in August 1944 near Sinthos. But his legacy lived on in the handful of Tiger crews still fighting in the ruins of Nazi Germany. One of them, Oberfeld Wiebel Kurt Meyer, sat in his Tiger outside Berlin, watching Soviet T-34s approach from the east while American Shermans closed from the west. His Tiger was the last operational heavy tank in the entire sector. Around him, Berlin burned. Germany was finished, everyone knew it. But Meyer's orders were to defend to the last, so he would defend. His 88mm gun could still kill tanks. He had perhaps 20 rounds of ammunition left. He could destroy 20 enemy tanks before he died. 20 tanks from 2 armies that had thousands. It was meaningless. Futile. But it was all he had left. The Tiger's engine rumbled. Meyer traversed the turret, looking for targets. A T-34 appeared, and he fired, the familiar recoil, the satisfying sight of the Soviet tank erupting in flame. 19 rounds left. 2 Shermans appeared from a side street. He destroyed one. 18 rounds left. The other Sherman fired, missed, retreated. More tanks would come. They always did. Meyer understood now what Germany's commanders should have understood years ago. You couldn't defeat industrial might with tactical skill. You couldn't defeat unlimited resources with limited genius. The Germans had built magnificent weapons and trained superb soldiers, but they'd lost the war in the factories of Detroit and the steel mills of Pittsburgh, in places they'd never seen and could never reach. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe. Bill Morrison received word at the factory. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. On the production line, Sherman number 71554 was nearing completion, but it wouldn't be needed. The line would complete the current orders, then convert to peacetime production. After 3 years of building nothing but tanks, they'd build cars again. Morrison walked down to the testing yard, where dozens of completed Shermans sat waiting for shipment that would never come. 71,554. That was just from this one factory. The total American production, 49,234 Shermans of all types, plus thousands of tank destroyers, self-propelled guns, and other armored vehicles. Germany had built approximately 1,500 Tigers and 6,000 Panthers, their best tanks, superior to the Sherman in nearly every way. But 49,234 versus 7,500. The arithmetic had been inevitable from the start. Lieutenant Henderson, now Captain Henderson, stood in a displaced persons camp in Bavaria, watching German prisoners file past. Former tankers, some of them. Men who'd crewed Tigers and Panthers. Men who'd destroyed dozens of Shermans. Men who'd fought brilliantly and lost completely. One of them, an older sergeant with a Knight's Cross at his throat, stopped and looked at Henderson's tank commander badge. "You are tanker?" he asked in broken English. "Yeah. Shermans. Since Normandy." The German nodded slowly. "Sherman. We call them Tommy Cooker.
Easy to destroy. I kill many. I'm sure you did. But always more come. We destroy 10, 20 come. We destroy those, 30 come. Like ocean waves. Never stop. The Germans' eyes were hollow. You win not because Sherman is better. You win because Sherman never stops coming. Henderson watched the man shuffle away to join the other prisoners. He thought about the 7 Shermans he'd had destroyed under him, the men he'd lost, the German tanks he'd seen burn. The Sherman had been derided, mocked, called a death trap. But it had done its job. Not by being better than the Tiger, but by being good enough, and being there in numbers that made tactical excellence irrelevant. The factories had won the war. The assembly lines. The production quotas. The logistics. The unglamorous, unromantic business of making thousands of adequate tanks instead of hundreds of perfect ones. War wasn't art. It was arithmetic. And in arithmetic, 50,000 Shermans would always beat 1,500 Tigers. As Captain Robert Henderson climbed into his Sherman for the last time, preparing to convoy to occupation duty, he ran his hand along the scarred hull. Factory number 67,843. It had carried him through the final weeks of the war. It would carry him a little further. Good enough, he said quietly, patting the steel. You were good enough. And good enough, multiplied by 50,000, had been more than enough.